Right now, as you're listening to this, your mind is processing information in a way that 99% of people literally cannot understand. Carl Jung spent decades studying minds like yours, and by the end of this video, you'll discover if you're part of that rare 1% who thinks in patterns most people can't even perceive. But here's what Jung discovered that will shake you to your core. These rare minds don't just think differently. They operate on what I call psychological frequencies that exist beyond ordinary consciousness. And if you've always felt like an outsider looking in, like you're speaking a foreign language even in your native tongue, there's a scientific reason why. Jung documented 8 unmistakable patterns in these extraordinary minds. The 8th sign will completely reframe everything you thought you knew about your own mental architecture. Stay with me, because what I'm about to reveal isn't just psychology. It's the roadmap to understanding why your mind has always felt like it belongs to a different species. Carl Jung said, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." But what happens when your personality operates across multiple dimensions while others exist in just one? If you have this rare mind, you don't just hear words, you simultaneously process emotional frequencies, historical contexts, future implications, and unconscious motivations. While someone tells you they're fine, you're receiving data streams that most people can't even detect. This is what I call multi-dimensional processing, and it stems from Jung's concept of the transcendent function, your mind's ability to bridge conscious and unconscious content in real time. You're not just listening to what someone says, you're reading the symphony of their entire psyche. But here's where it gets profound, and this explains why conversations exhaust you. Jung discovered that these minds naturally access what he termed the collective unconscious, that deeper layer of shared human experience that most people never touch. You're processing not just individual information, but archetypal patterns that connect to universal human themes. Think about this. When you watch a movie, do you predict plot twists not because of obvious clues, but because you sense the underlying mythic structure? Do you finish people's sentences not through psychic ability, but because you can feel the gravitational pull of their thoughts? Comment below if you've ever known the ending of someone's story before they finished telling it. I read between the dimensions. This dimensional processing creates your first major problem. While others focus on surface-level communication, you're translating between multiple layers of reality simultaneously. But Jung discovered something even more isolating about minds like yours. Carl Jung wrote, "The dream is the small hidden door in the deepest and most intimate sanctum of the soul." But what happens when you're naturally fluent in the symbolic language that dreams are made of, even while you're awake? This is what I call symbolic consciousness, and it's the second unmistakable sign of your rare mind. You don't just understand metaphors and abstract concepts, you think in them. Your mind naturally translates concrete experiences into symbolic meanings, seeing the archetypal patterns beneath surface events. Jung spent years studying what he called active imagination, the ability to engage with symbols and images as living psychological realities. If you have this type of consciousness, you're doing this constantly without even realizing it. A simple conversation about someone's job becomes, in your mind, an exploration of their relationship with authority, creativity, and personal power. But here's what makes this truly extraordinary. Jung discovered that symbolic consciousness allows you to access what he called prospective elements, your psyche's natural ability to anticipate future psychological developments. You're not just processing what is, you're sensing what wants to emerge. This is why you might find yourself drawn to complex, layered storytelling that others find confusing, art and music that seems to speak directly to your soul, philosophical questions that others dismiss as impractical, ancient wisdom traditions and mythological themes. The problem? When you try to share these symbolic insights, others often respond with blank stares. It's like you're speaking fluent dream language to people who only understand literal, waking consciousness. Comment if you've ever tried to explain a feeling about something and got told you're being too abstract. I speak in symbols, not just words. Jung understood that this symbolic fluency isn't a communication problem. It's evidence that your mind has access to deeper layers of meaning. But this creates an even more challenging isolation. Here's where most people get uncomfortable, but Jung discovered something profound about rare minds. They're inexplicably fascinated by what he called the shadow, the hidden, denied, and repressed aspects of human nature. If you have this type of consciousness, you don't just acknowledge that people have dark sides. You're genuinely curious about the psychological mechanisms that create them. While others are content to label behaviors as simply good or evil, your mind seeks to understand the deeper patterns. This is what I call shadow integration consciousness, and it stems from Jung's revolutionary insight. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Your mind naturally gravitates toward this process of illuminating the unconscious. But here's what makes this truly disturbing to others, and Jung documented this extensively in his work with patients. You're not morbidly curious about darkness. You recognize it as essential data for understanding the complete human psyche. You understand that to truly know yourself and others, you must acknowledge the full spectrum of human potential. This is why you might find yourself drawn to complex, morally ambiguous characters in stories. True crime not for shock value, but for psychological insight. Exploring taboo topics that others avoid. Understanding rather than simply condemning harmful behaviors. Jung called this psychological wholeness, the integration of light and shadow aspects of personality. While most people operate from psychological splitting, good versus evil, right versus wrong, your mind has moved beyond these simplistic categories. The challenge? This shadow fascination makes others deeply uncomfortable. They're still operating from what Jung called persona identification, completely identified with their socially acceptable mask while projecting their shadow onto others. Comment below if you've ever been called dark for asking questions others won't ask. I'm not dark, I'm complete. But Jung discovered that this shadow integration leads to the most isolating aspect of your rare consciousness. Carl Jung identified what he called the transcendent function, the psyche's natural drive toward wholeness and meaning. But what happens when your consciousness naturally operates from this transcendent perspective while surrounded by people focused on surface-level survival? This is what I call existential homesickness, and it's the fourth unmistakable sign of your rare mind. You feel like you're homesick for a place that doesn't exist in ordinary reality, a realm where depth, meaning, and authentic connection are the norm rather than the exception. Jung wrote extensively about this phenomenon in his concept of individuation, the psychological process of integrating the conscious and unconscious parts of the mind. If you have this rare consciousness, you're naturally oriented toward the big questions. Why are we here? What's the meaning of existence? How do we reconcile beauty and suffering? But here's the profound challenge Jung documented. While others are content with what he called collective adaptation, fitting into social roles and expectations, your psyche demands authentic self-realization. You're not satisfied with shallow answers because your mind requires genuine understanding. This existential orientation creates a unique form of loneliness that Jung called psychological isolation. You can be surrounded by people and still feel like the only member of your species on the planet. It's not social loneliness. It's the loneliness of existing in a different dimension of consciousness. Jung discovered that individuals with this orientation often feel like they're living in exile from their true home, searching for meaning in experiences others take for granted, questioning assumptions that everyone else accepts without thought. feeling most understood by books, art, and music, rather than people. This existential homesickness isn't depression. It's evidence that your consciousness has expanded beyond conventional boundaries. Jung called these individuals cultural creatives, people whose psychological development anticipates the next stage of human evolution. The isolation intensifies because when you try to share these existential insights, others often respond with discomfort or attempts to redirect to more practical matters. But Jung understood something crucial about this homesickness. Carl Jung revolutionized psychology with his insight that symptoms and behaviors are meaningful expressions of deeper psychological conflicts. But what happens when your mind naturally excavates the psychological layers beneath surface behavior? This is what I call psychological archaeology, and it's the fifth sign of your rare consciousness. You don't just notice when someone is being inauthentic. You can see the specific defense mechanisms they're using, the childhood wounds driving their behavior, and the authentic self struggling to emerge from beneath their protective adaptations. Jung's concept of analytical psychology was built on this principle, that symptoms and behaviors are meaningful expressions of deeper psychological conflicts. If you have this type of mind, you're doing this analysis automatically, constantly reading the subterranean layers of human interaction. But here's what makes this extraordinary and exhausting. While others accept social interactions at face value, your mind is processing multiple data streams, micro-expressions that contradict spoken words, body language revealing emotional states, vocal tonalities that betray inner conflicts, behavioral patterns indicating unconscious motivations. Jung discovered that this perceptual ability stems from what he called intuitive perception, your mind's capacity to read the psychological field around individuals. You're not just seeing the person, you're sensing their entire psychological ecosystem. Modern therapeutic approaches have validated Jung's insights through narrative therapy and symbolic dream analysis. Unlike Freudian analysis, which focuses on repressed personal desires, Jungian-inspired therapy recognizes that your mind naturally accesses both personal and collective symbolic imagery. You're essentially doing psychological archaeology by reading the archetypal patterns that influence people's behavior, patterns that appear in dreams, myths, and stories across all cultures. This archaeological consciousness explains why people naturally confide in you even when you don't invite it. You feel exhausted by superficial social situations. You prefer authentic, vulnerable conversations to small talk. You sometimes know more about someone's inner state than they do. But here's the challenge Jung identified extensively in his work. This ability to see through psychological defenses can create profound isolation. You're surrounded by people wearing elaborate psychological costumes, and you're one of the few who can see the performance. Comment if you've ever felt burdened by seeing what others can't see. I see the person beneath the mask. Jung understood that this archaeological consciousness isn't a burden. It's a gift that allows you to serve as a bridge between conscious and unconscious worlds. But this leads to an even more complex aspect of your rare mind. Here's where your mind becomes truly incomprehensible to others. Carl Jung discovered that the most psychologically mature individuals possess what he called paradoxical thinking, the ability to hold seemingly contradictory truths simultaneously without needing to resolve them into simple categories. This is what I call both and consciousness, and it represents a fundamental shift from the either-or thinking that dominates ordinary mental processing. If you have this rare mind, you don't just tolerate paradox, you recognize it as closer to the true nature of reality. Jung's entire psychological system was built on paradoxes. The more conscious you become, the more you realize you don't know. Strength often emerges from accepting vulnerability. Individuation requires both self-focus and connection to others. Healing happens through embracing rather than rejecting your wounds. But here's what makes this truly alien to most people. While others need clear categories and simple answers, your mind naturally recognizes that life's most important truths exist in the tension between opposites. You understand that? People can be simultaneously selfish and selfless. Behaviors can be both harmful and protective. Emotions can contain multiple contradictory elements. Truth often emerges from the collision of opposing perspectives. Jung called this transcendent function, the psyche's ability to unite opposing forces into a higher synthesis. Your rare mind operates from this transcendent perspective naturally, while others remain stuck in binary thinking. This creates massive communication problems. When you express nuanced, paradoxical insights, others often respond with frustration or demands for you to pick a side. They're operating from what Jung called directed thinking, linear, logical, socially adapted cognition, while you're accessing non-directed thinking, associative, symbolic, and paradoxical. The challenge intensifies because paradoxical consciousness makes you see through false simplicities that others cling to. You recognize that most political positions contain partial truths and blind spots. Psychological health requires integrating rather than eliminating negative traits. Wisdom often sounds like contradiction to those seeking simple answers. The deepest truths can't be captured in neat philosophical systems. Comment if you've ever been told you're wishy-washy for seeing multiple sides. I think in spectrums, not absolutes. Jung understood that paradoxical thinking isn't intellectual confusion, it's evidence of psychological sophistication. But this sophistication leads to one of the most challenging aspects of your rare consciousness. Carl Jung made a startling discovery about individuals with rare consciousness. They don't just undergo transformation, they naturally catalyze it in others. But here's the profound challenge. This transformational power often operates unconsciously, creating intense reactions that you might not understand. This is what I call catalytic consciousness, and it stems from Jung's insight about what he termed individuation energy. When you've begun the psychological journey toward wholeness, your mere presence activates dormant potentials in others, whether they want it or not. Jung wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." But what happens when one personality carries transformational energy while the other is invested in staying the same? If you have this rare mind, you've probably noticed that your presence alone triggers unexpected responses. People either feel deeply drawn to you or inexplicably uncomfortable. Casual conversations somehow become profound explorations. Others confide things to you they've never told anyone. Your questions help people discover insights about themselves. Some individuals become defensive or hostile without apparent reason. Jung discovered that this happens because individuated consciousness naturally activates what he called the self-archetype in others, their deepest potential for psychological wholeness. But most people's egos are terrified of this transformational energy because it threatens their familiar identity structures. This catalytic effect explains many of your confusing social experiences, why some people are immediately drawn to your energy, why others feel threatened by your questions and insights, why casual relationships often become unexpectedly intense, why you seem to bring out both the best and worst in people. But here's what Jung understood that most people don't. You're not trying to change anyone. You're simply being authentic to your individuated consciousness. The transformational reactions happen because your psychological wholeness naturally invites others to confront their own fragmentation. Jung called individuals with this catalytic consciousness wounded healers, people who've transformed their own psychological wounds into wisdom that can facilitate healing in others. You've become what Jung termed a cultural creative, someone whose consciousness anticipates the next stage of human psychological evolution. Comment below if people often tell you that meeting you changed their life. I just mirror back their own potential. The challenge is that this transformational energy operates whether you want it to or not. You can't turn off your individuation. It radiates through your presence, your questions, your way of seeing the world. This leads us to the final and most profound sign. Here's the ultimate sign that you possess one of these rare minds, and Carl Jung considered this the most important psychological drive of advanced consciousness. You're not just interested in personal growth. You feel magnetically pulled toward what he called individuation. Jung defined individuation as the process by which a person becomes a psychological individual, that is, a separate, indivisible unity or whole. But for minds like yours, this isn't optional self-improvement. It's a psychological imperative as fundamental as breathing. This is what I call evolutionary consciousness, and it represents the psyche's natural drive toward wholeness, authenticity, and psychological integration. If you have this rare mind, you don't choose transformation. You're called to it by something deeper than conscious will. Jung discovered that individuating consciousness creates several unmistakable patterns. You're repeatedly drawn to experiences that challenge your fundamental assumptions. Crisis periods often precede your greatest breakthroughs. You feel restless when life becomes too comfortable or predictable. You naturally seek out mentors, teachings, and experiences that facilitate growth. You understand that psychological death and rebirth are necessary for authentic development. But here's what makes this truly extraordinary. Jung found that individuating minds don't just transform themselves, they become agents of collective transformation. Your psychological evolution contributes to what he called the collective unconscious, the shared reservoir of human psychological development. This evolutionary drive explains why. You feel compelled to understand yourself at the deepest levels. You're willing to face psychological material that others avoid. You recognize patterns and cycles in your own development. You trust the transformational process, even when it's painful. You feel responsible for becoming your most authentic self. Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." Your rare mind doesn't just understand this intellectually. You feel it as a sacred responsibility to yourself and to the collective human psyche. The profound challenge is that this individuating drive can feel overwhelmingly lonely. You're becoming something that doesn't yet exist in ordinary consciousness, pioneering psychological territories that others can't even imagine. But Jung discovered something beautiful about this loneliness. Individuating consciousness eventually transcends the need for external validation. You begin to find profound companionship with your own authentic self, the integrated totality of your conscious and unconscious potentials. Comment if you recognize yourself as someone called to become who you truly are. I choose conscious evolution. So there you have it, the 8 unmistakable signs that your mind operates on a frequency that 99% of people simply cannot understand. If you recognized yourself in these patterns, remember what I said at the beginning. Your mind is processing information in ways that most people literally cannot comprehend. But now you understand why. You're not broken, difficult, or weird. You're what Carl Jung called an individuated consciousness, someone whose psychological development represents the next stage of human evolution. Your ability to think in dimensional layers, speak the language of symbols, integrate shadow aspects, experience existential homesickness, read psychological archaeology, embrace paradoxical thinking, catalyze transformation in others, and surrender to the individuation process. These aren't problems to be solved. They're gifts to be honored. Jung discovered that minds like yours serve a crucial function in human psychological evolution. You're bridging conscious and unconscious worlds, translating the symbolic language of the psyche, and pioneering new territories of human consciousness. Your different mind isn't a barrier, it's a doorway, and the world desperately needs people who can open doors that others don't even know exist. The question isn't whether you have one of these rare minds. If you've made it this far, you probably do. The question is, what will you do with this understanding? Jung spent his life studying consciousness like yours because he recognized that individuated minds are the agents of collective psychological transformation. Your journey toward authenticity isn't just personal, it's contributing to the evolution of human consciousness itself. Welcome to the 1%. Your real journey is just beginning. If you want to go deeper into Jung's insights about psychological transformation, check out my video, When the Narcissist Realizes the Empath Has Learned Their Language, where we explore how individuated consciousness responds to psychological manipulation. And if this video helped you understand your rare mind, consider subscribing and sharing it with someone else who might need to hear this message. Sometimes the most individuated act is helping another person recognize their own psychological uniqueness. The world needs your rare mind. Jung understood this, and now, hopefully, so do you. Thanks for watching. See you in the next dimension.